Alright, YouTubers, welcome back to my channel. I'm Mr. Digital 45. Alright, now I have a movie called Stargate sitting up here in front because I think I forgot about it. So, here's this before I start to tease. Stargate. Alright, we're going to start this. First step is 3 billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri. Next up, we've got some Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges and George C. Scott and Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. Next up, we got Tomorrowland. Next up, we got Toy Story. Woo. They're sliding right off. Next up, Toy Story. Next up, we got some Toy Story 2. Then we got some Toy Story 3. I don't have the fourth one, so I'm sorry about that. Next up, we got the Criterion Collection of Time Bandits. So, yeah, that's a real good one there. Got all kinds of special features on here. Next up, we got Arnold Schwarzenegger and the 4K Total Recall. Sharon Stone's also in this, and Michael Ironside. Can't forget about Michael Ironside. Great character actor. Next up, we got, I think this is a Thor. Marvel's Thor. Chris Hemsworth. Natalie Portman. Todd Hiddleston. Next up, we got Cary Grant, Gene Arthur, and Ronald Colman in The Talk of the Town. Next up, we got a Walt Disney cartoon movie, Treasure Planet. Next up, we got the late Fred Ward in Time Rider. Next up, we got Rod Taylor in The Time Machine. Next up, we got Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell in Tombstone. Also with Bill Paxton and Sam Elliott. Michael Biehn. Powers Booth. Next up, we got the remake 13 Ghosts. Next up, we got Shirley MacLaine and Deborah Winger and Jack Nicholson in Terms of Endearment. Next up, we got Casper Van Dien in Tarzan and the Lost City. Next up, we got the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. Next up, we got Thor, The Dark World. Remember, these are not in any alphabetical order, so when they show up, they show until I put them in there. Ooh. Next up, we got Thor Ragnarok. Next up, we got some Jamie Lee Curtis, Ben Johnson, and David Copperfield. That's right, David Copperfield is in this great horror movie with Jamie Lee Curtis called Terror Train. Next up, we got some John Forsythe and Shirley MacLaine and The Trouble with Harry, an Alfred Hitchcock movie. Next up, we got a movie called Tangled. Alright, next up we got some Jim Carrey in The Truman Show. Next up we got Albert Finney and Audrey Hepburn in Two for the Road. Next up, we got some Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward. Tremors. Next up, we got Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, and Titanic. Yes, they made a movie about the Titanic before James Cameron made a movie about Titanic. For all you people who didn't know. Next up, we got some Vin Diesel and Triple X, the uncensored, unrated director's cut. Alright, next up, we got some Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway and the Thomas Crown Affair. Next up, we got some Kevin Costner and Rene Russo in Tin Cup. Followed by Pierce Brosnan and Rene Russo in the remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, which I just showed you with Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. This is the remake. Next up, we got some Charlie Sheen and Natasha Kinski in Terminal Velocity. Alright, next up we got some Margot Robbie, Simon Pegg, and Mike Myers in Terminal. Alright, moving right along. Next up we got some John Payne, Maureen O'Hara, and Randolph Scott in To the Shores of Tripoli. Next up, we got some Burt Reynolds in Tempted. Next up, we got John Carpenter's classic, The Thing, which is a remake of the 1953 or 54 movie, Thing from Another World, but this one's just called The Thing. Alright, Give me a little minute here. I'm trying to grab another stack here down. Alright, next up we got the Tom Cruise classic Top Gun, the original one. Val Kilmer, Anthony Edwards, young Meg Ryan, before she was famous. Next up we got Jeff Bridges in the original Tron movie. Also with Bruce Boxleitner. Next up we got Ben Stiller, Jack Black, and Robert Downey Jr. in Tropic Thunder, the director's cut. Alright, next up we got the director's cut of Troy with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana. Next up we got Jack Black and Kyle Gass and Tenacious D, The Pick of Destiny. Alright, next up we got some Clint Eastwood and True Crime. Next up we got Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short in The Three Amigos. This is still sealed. I've seen it, but I haven't unwrapped this. Next up, we got some Dustin Hoffman, Jessica Lange, Tootsie, and Gina Davis also, young Gina Davis, and Terry Garr. Bill Murray is also in this in a small role. Alright, next up we got some Sean Connery and Thunderball, James Bond classic. That was his fourth outing as James Bond. Next up, we got John Wayne's Oscar-winning performance in True Grit, also with Kim Darby and Glenn Campbell. Next up, we got Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael Biehn, and The Terminator. Also Linda Hamilton. It's funky. Kind of glossy. It's got a glossy cover. Oh. Next up, we got the James Cameron movie Titanic. Kate Winslet, Leonardo DiCaprio, of course. Next up, we got a Disney classic short film, The Tortoise and the Hare. Next up, we got some Cary Grant and Grace Kelly in To Catch a Thief, Alfred Hitchcock movie. Alright, next up we got some Chuck Norris, Top Dog. Alright, we're getting through these. Next up we got John Wayne, Robert Montgomery, and Donna Reed, and They Were Expendable. I believe this is a John Ford movie. Yes, it is. There's a John Ford movie. Of course, John Wayne's in it. Alright, we got Mel Gibson, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Kurt Russell in Tequila Sunrise. Very underrated movie. I really like that movie. Just check it out if you like that kind of stuff. Alright, next up we got some Angelina Jolie and the sequel to her Tomb Raider movie, Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life. Tomb Raider's probably in here somewhere. Next up, we got some Glenn Ford and Van Heflin in the original 310 to Yuma. Alright, next up we got some James Cagney and Barbara Stanwyck in 3 Wilder Years. Alright, next up we got Tom Selleck, Steve Guttenberg, and Ted Danson in 3 Men and a Baby. Next up, they thought they'd be bringing this movie out on 4K this year. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis in True Lies. Alright, next up we got Sandra Bullock in 28 Days. Next up we got some Wesley Snipes, John Leguizamo, and Patrick Swayze in To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything, Julian Newmar. Next up, we got Bruce Willis in Tears of the Sun, extended cut. Next up, we got some Sylvester Stallone and Kurt Russell in Tango and Cash. Next up, we got a movie called Talk Radio, directed by Oliver Stone. Next up, we got Woody Allen in Take the Money and Run. We got a movie called Timeline, followed by Tim and Eric's $1 Billion Movie. Next up we got Nicolas Cage and Nicole Kidman in Trespass. Followed by Nicolas Cage, John Lovitz, and Dana Carvey in Trapped in Paradise. Alright, next up we got some Eddie Murphy and Ben Stiller in Tower Heist. Followed by Transformers the movie. The animated movie from '86, I believe. Next up, we got some Charlton Heston, Janet Leigh, and Orson Welles, and Touch of Evil. Next up, we got Tin Man, which is, I think, a version of the Oz, but told in a different way. It's like a mini-series. It was. I never have watched it yet, though. I need to. Next up, we got Jason Statham, The Transporter. Next up, we got one of them anthology movies they made back in the day, Hammer and all them, called Torture Garden. There's a bunch of little stories. It's really good. Burgess Meredith is right there. That's one of the stars I can remember. It's been a while since I watched it. Next up, we got some Peter Weller, Dennis Hopper, and Tia Carrere in Top of the World. Followed by the late great John Ritter, Joyce DeWitt, and Suzanne Summers. Three's Company, Season 1. Alright, next up we got Gregory Peck and To Kill a Mockingbird. Followed by the war drama Thin Red Line. Big all-star cast: George Clooney, Nick Nolte, Woody Harrelson, John Cusack, John C. Reilly, Sean Penn. Just a bunch of people in it. Next up, we got the creators of South Park. Did this movie called Team America World Police, uncensored and unrated. Alright, next up we got some Pierce Brosnan and Tomorrow Never Dies. One of his outings with James Bond. Next up, we got some Chris Farley and David Spade and Tommy Boy, the Holy Shnikey edition. Next up, we got Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Tooth Fairy. Next, we got Mark Wahlberg and Mila Kunis and Seth MacFarlane's Ted, the unrated edition. I do believe I have the first one. Next up, we got some Kirk Douglas, Henry Fonda, Warren Oates, Burgess Meredith. There Was a Crooked Man. Alright. Next up, we got a Disney kind of little short animated film, The Three Musketeers, with Mickey, Donald, and Goofy. And of course, you know, Pluto and probably all the other ones are in it too. Alright, hold on here a minute. Second. Gotta pull these over so I can reach them, so I can finish it up. Alright, next up we got the World War II drama Tora, 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 which is told basically from the Japanese side of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Next up, we got some Charlie Sheen, Kiefer Sutherland, Oliver Platt, and Chris O'Donnell, and Tim Curry, and the Three Musketeers. And I think Rebecca De Mornay is in this too. Whoop. Next up, we got Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, and They Died with Their Boots On. I think this is about Custer's last stand, I'm pretty sure. Not positive, but it's been a while since I watched it. Next up, we got the original Tomb Raider movie with Angelina Jolie. I showed you the sequel earlier. And here's kind of the reboot movie that came out and remake, Tomb Raider. Alright, next up we got Tom Hanks in That Thing You Do. He also directed this movie, and it's an extended cut. So it's his original vision he wanted to do of this movie. Next up, we got some Clint Eastwood, Tightrope. Alright, next up we got a nice little comedy from the 80s, 3 O'Clock High. Next up we got the remake of The Time Machine with Guy Pearce. This is The Time Machine. Next up we got the Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon classic, Thelma and Louise. Next up we got the Arrow video release of True Romance. This is really, really cool. They give you the 4K, and they give you these a book, and I think this is a poster. So yeah, it's really all right. Next up we got Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft and To Be or Not to Be. Next up we got Ryan O'Neal, who just recently passed, and Isabella Rossellini and Tough Guys Don't Dance. Next up we got another horror classic, and this is Tourist Trap Uncut. Chuck Connors, Tanya Roberts. Alright, next up we got some Michael J. Fox and Jason Bateman in Teen Wolf and Teen Wolf 2, a double feature DVD. Next up, we got Robert Pattinson, the guy that plays Batman now. My brain is going blank on the girl. Kristen Stewart in Twilight. I got these from my daughter. She loves them. Next up, we got the second one, I believe, New Moon. Followed by Twilight Eclipse. Followed by Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1. And Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2. I believe that's all of them. Next up, we got the Disney classic Tarzan. Next up, we got Humphrey Bogart and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I like how it says they sold their souls for it. Alright, I have a double. As you can see, probably getting rid of that one. I got the better 2-disc edition, but there is the other one. Alright, next up we got Nicolas Cage and Elijah Wood in The Trust. Next up we got Sherilyn Fenn and Two Moon Junction. Next up we got the sequel to Chinatown with Jack Nicholson and the Two Jakes. Next up we got some Robert Mitchum and Track of the Cat. Followed by Rodney the Rowdy Piper. And They Live, John Carpenter classic. 4K. Alright, next up we got some George Raft, Humphrey Bogart, Ann Sheridan, and Ida Lupino in They Drive by Night. Alright, here we got the Anchor Bay release of Time Bandits. All it has is a trailer on it. I have the Criterion collection, but I'm going to keep this because it's an Anchor Bay release. And I think this one's out of print. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on it. Also, I showed you the Blu-ray earlier of this. There's the DVD of the Thomas Crown Affair. Also, probably be keeping this. I'm not sure. Alright. Next up, we got the Train Robbers, John Wayne, Anne Margaret, and Rod Taylor. Also with Ben Johnson. Next up, we got the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Blu-ray Steelbook. Also, I have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 4K Steelbook, which I'm keeping both of them. I know, I double dip, but heck, it's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What can I say? You horror fans out there, you know what I'm talking about. Alright. Next up is Take This Waltz. Seth Rogen, Michelle Williams. Next up, we have Clint Eastwood and Two Mules for Sister Sarah, also with Shirley MacLaine. Next up, we got Paul Newman in Twilight, also with Susan Sarandon and Gene Hackman. Yes, there's another movie called Twilight that isn't about vampires. Glowing vampires, I should say. Alright, my last two of the teas. We got Jason Statham in The Transporter Part 3. I need Part 2, but I have one, which I showed you earlier, which I have on Blu-ray. Then I have this one, which is Part 3. Then I got Liam Neeson in Taken 2, the unrated cut. I do not have the first one or the other one, so I also need that. Alright, people, don't forget to like and subscribe. What I mean by like, I'm lifting this camera up now, is give that thumbs up. That's right, the thumbs up. And until next time, see ya.